I have the honor of being on the Board of Trustees and the Chairman of the Student Life Committee. It's a great honor for me to do that, especially as an alumni from an undergraduate and a graduate degree program here. And as some of you know, we were here for commencement in December, where our oldest daughter received her master's from Worldwide with Dr. Doctorate. She now tells me that she's equal to me because she's as well educated as I am. And I told her that is correct, you are, and I'm proud of that, to bring forth another eagle. However, why don't you start paying for your own bills? Didn't go over too good. So welcome, thanks for coming, we really appreciate it. Harry and Ada Lamon from Atlanta, one of our trustee emeritus. This is their first in a speaker series that he has funded. Unfortunately, she is ill now, and he was unable to make the trip. Dr. Boa, we think she's doing better. She had a procedure today, a cardiac procedure that we're hoping will get her into a better area. So where she is. So they wanted to bring to Embry-Riddle a different venue of our traditional science and math, and aviation and engineering, and et cetera, et cetera. So we have the honor of having Dr. Boa here today. I will read you briefly some of his credentials, but we don't have that long for me to keep reading, because he has about virtually every credential that we could possibly have. So I don't want to rob a lot of his time. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree from the Case Institute of Technology, a Master of Theology from Dallas Theological Seminary, a Doctorate from New York University, and a Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Oxford, of course in England. He will speak on science, faith, a visual presentation that develops the implications of the fundamentals features of the world, evidence from the universe's beginning, the fine-tuning of the cosmos, and the origin of simplest cell and information theory related to DNA. Now, as an aviator, I have no idea what any of that means. That's why I'm here to listen. So if you'll welcome with me Dr. Kenneth Boa.
Thank you. Okay, we're going to be launching on a rapid journey, and we're going to have some time for question and answer. So that'll be the most important time that we have together. This is an adaptation of a presentation I've tested before at the University of Vienna in Austria and at Harvard Medical School, but now I've expanded it. So you're the first ones to hear the bigger version of this presentation, in which, as you see, I try to take 4 fundamental features of the world and explore their implications. And so we're going to be looking first at what do we mean by worldviews and paradigms, a way of viewing, a way of looking at the world itself, looking at these features of the world, and then in light of that, draw out a few implications. We're going to try to do that in under an hour. So we're going to be moving rather rapidly, but just giving you some overall impressions. And so as we speak about worldviews and paradigms, a way of visualizing the world in which we find ourselves immersed, immediately there are many who have a typical objection that science itself has nothing to do with faith. And so there's a bifurcation that takes place in those two arenas in many people's minds. We're going to comment on that. But it is interesting that science only appeared once, really, as we know it, in human history. There was technology. There was technology in Babylonia. There was technology in China. There was technology in Greece. But there was no such thing as science as we know it until the period of the Renaissance in Western Europe. And it was based, I believe, on a confluence of understandings based upon a particular way of viewing the world. Namely that the world is rational, that is ordered, that it is a correspondence as well between we the observers and what we actually observe. And being rational and understood world in that context. It was a theistic context. It was interesting that in the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, they didn't originate science because in many ways the universe was an illusion. Maya, Lila, God's play, and so forth, or polytheistic religions would have tended to move more in the area of worship of the thing itself. And so this notion of some kind of logos, one who spoke, a mind that spoke things into being, stimulated the progenitors of science, such as Copernicus, Galileo, William Harvey, Blaise Pascal, Isaac Newton, Joseph Priestley, Michael Faraday, Louis Pasteur, Gregor Mendel, and many, many others who approached this from a largely theistic point of view, namely the idea that there is an ordering agency behind it. And these were people who saw that their science could in fact be construed as a means or an act of worship, and thus they regarded their theistic position as not only fully compatible with science, but also something that was a natural byproduct of that logical implication. And so science and faith, when we have an atheistic standpoint, it's an illusion, I'm going to be arguing, to suggest that the atheist lives only by science or by reason alone, and that the theist lives by faith without evidence. Both that really embrace a worldview that requires a measure of faith to understand. In fact, the atheist, again, has to believe that the universe is in fact ordered and rational, and that the mind is rational enough to correspond with what is actually being perceived in the external world, correspond with reality. But it does not provide the philosophical foundation or framework for those operational beliefs, because it implies that our minds are just byproducts of random processes in the first place, so that there is in fact a faith proposition that's involved in corresponding what we see and what is understood to be the implications of what we see. In fact, it was in the late 19th century that science was more or less redefined, moving away from an empirical method and actually replaced by that method plus a naturalistic standpoint. That is to say, first methodological naturalism, and then later a more or less philosophical naturalism. That is to say, the supposition in naturalism is that ultimate reality has nothing that transcends matter, energy, time, and space, that there is thereby nothing spiritual, nothing that goes beyond what is actually found in the material world. My own argument is that that is not actually how science was in fact founded in the first place, and that correctly defined should be regarded as a method of as Charles Sanders Peirce called it, abduction, basically inference to the best explanation. And so when we're dealing with that, then we're dealing with going where the evidence leads, is, in my view, a better approach to understanding the approach that we have to grasping the world around us. In addition, scientific knowledge, though very powerful, is not the only vehicle for knowledge. There are other vehicles as well, and that's why positivism has fallen on bad times, the supposition that if I can't measure it, it's not true. But that's actually a statement that can't be measured, so it's a self-defeating proposition. There's historical knowledge, there's personal knowledge, there's moral knowledge, philosophical knowledge, aesthetic knowledge, and religious knowledge, and all these approaches to knowledge require their own method of apprehension. And it's not to say that any one of them is in fact exhaustive, but all contribute to a larger whole. So we're saying that they need to be tempered with a larger grasp of what's going on. And that design theory per se, the claim has been in recent years that any kind of quest for design would kill science. And I'm going to be arguing that actually, that this is not actually a good way of putting it. The error is that the design theory is the same as theology. But there's a growing number of people, including my favorite atheist, Thomas Nagel, who actually would argue otherwise. He just wrote a book recently called Mind and Cosmos. And though he has no theological axe to grind, he says, I don't have any sense of God at all. Nevertheless, it's interesting, the title of his book did not actually win him friends with it in the atheistic community. Mind and Cosmos, why the naturalistic neo-Darwinian account of the universe is almost certainly false. This did not win him friends, as you can imagine. But Nagel, as an atheist, was arguing that there are paradigm shifts that are going on. In fact, he himself said, though he doesn't believe in any kind of personal designing agency, it could potentially be scientific to argue that the DNA of life, the data of DNA and life points to some kind of an intelligent designer, even if science cannot tell you the identity of the designer or what is going on in the designer's mind. And there turns out to be a rather large spectrum that's going on here of design theorists that range from what you could call deistic evolution to theistic evolution to old Earth creationism to young Earth creationism. Some of you may be aware of the debate recently between Bill Nye, the science guy, and Ken Ham. In my own view, Ham is trying to prove way too much, and that's a big tent. And in this big tent, there's a lot of room for disagreement about the who and the when and the how of the whole idea of the nature of design. But to take a more modest perspective, I think, can be valuable, because this is one thing that they would all share in common, the idea that there is an openness to some design agency that transcends mere philosophical materialism. Einstein himself, I would put on this end of the spectrum. His was the God of Spinoza. He believed in a super intelligence that existed, and some years later, in Anthony Flue's life, when he was 82 years old, he was the Dawkins of the 70s, effectively. And he came to the conclusion at the age of 82, which was quite shocking to me when I heard it. I'd met him before in his atheistic phase, that actually there's got to be some kind of design agency. He was ultimately convinced because of the fact that the 6 feet of DNA in each one of your 100 trillion cells contains more information than an entire set of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And things of this sort convinced him, in fact, that there must be some kind of a design agency, some kind of super intelligence. And so I, again, put him on that part of the spectrum. But what they all share from the whole under the tent is this idea of at least an openness to a design agency as opposed to a naturalistic causality. Now, I find that what's happened in the literature or in popular media is often guilt by association or some kind of extreme views of ad hominem arguments in which we have ridicule as the establishment of argument rather than actual something that is metaphysically proven or whatever. We have these kinds of name-calling rather than dealing with the science. My desire in our time together is just to look at the evidence itself and just consider where the evidence might lead. In fact, it's significant that we already are aware of sciences that distinguish between design and accident. This is not something that's foreign to the scientific inquiry. For example, we're dealing with forensic science, or say intellectual property law, or if we're dealing with insurance claim investigation, was that arson? Or was it something that was intentional, unintentional, frayed wiring? When you're dealing with cryptology, there's a need for, again, distinguishing design from accident, as well as artificial intelligence and certainly archaeology. Does this look like an axe head, or was it just something that's an artifact that appeared that way? And again, being able to discern inference to the best explanation, whether that is warranted. If I see a cairn, for example, a stack of stones in the woods, it makes one suspicious. Or SETI, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, again, by its very nature, appeals to some kind of a design agency insofar as there's a quest for finding patterns that transcend something that would just be natural or stochastic. And so we have the same as also as in random number generation. So all of these things we already are aware of the difference, clear ways of understanding the design inference. I would also want to argue that design itself, the idea of intelligent design or whatever you want to call it, is not creationism 2.0, but rather my own view is to go where the evidence leads and draw conclusions from that. And in this momentum of evidence, as I see it, as time goes by, we're discovering greater and greater levels of complexity, information, elegance, and we're finding that these characteristics, in fact, can be predictable. This is why years ago when I first heard about, for example, junk DNA, namely the genetic material that does not code for protein expression, about 97 and 98% of the genome does not code for protein expression. So the supposition was that it was junk DNA. My own view was right from the beginning that that would probably not be the case in the time ahead. And though we did not know what we did, it would be rather arrogant to call it junk just because we don't know what it does. As it turns out, quite recently, this so-called junk DNA turns out to be operating systems. In fact, a couple of hierarchical levels of operating systems that switch them on and off in a way that mediates the expression of proteins. And so it's actually more sophisticated, not less, than we might have otherwise supposed. And so looking at the four features that we're going to be looking at in our time together, I want to look first of all at evidences for the universe's beginning. And so the first of these four features of the world, we live in a time where I think it's exciting that we can categorically say that the universe had some kind of a beginning. And the if proposition that I propose is if anything now exists, some question that, something must be eternal, or something not eternal must have emerged from nothing. And this raises some interesting questions along these lines, because the first possibility is that the universe may be an illusion, and some hold to that position. Secondly, the steady state theory particularly was such that the universe was held to be an eternal reality. Or the third option, that it emerged from nothing, and the fourth, that it was created by an eternal being, which is an interesting thing for us to explore, because taking the first one, about the universe being an illusion, even the full-blown Hindu who claims ultimately in a philosophical sense that ultimate reality is illusory looks both ways before crossing the street. It becomes, in fact, a system that is very unlivable, and one cannot be consistent with it. It lacks rational coherence and livability. It's like saying I can't speak a word in English. Well, I just did that. And so it's a self-defeater, if you see where I'm going with that. The idea of the universe being eternal, and this is one of the reasons why, as I said before, it didn't lead to science in terms of technology, but not science as we know it. The steady state theory was quite popular for most of the first part of the 20th century, because many astronomers wanted that to be the case. There was this desire, one thing it would, of course, do is eliminate any need for a divine agency, and that view was embraced. Even the astronomer Fred Hoyle, for a certain period of time, actually argued that there may be somehow at the fringes of the cosmos some continuous creation going on, which is an interesting thing because he's effectively violating the first law of thermodynamics in making such a claim. But it was an interesting thing, but it turned out to be a faith proposition, which he later rescinded. But what we're dealing here with something without evidence. But the astronomer Edwin Hubble, when he discovered that the universe was really expanding in a uniform way in all directions, it led a number of other people to come up with this interesting term, Big Bang cosmology, the hot Big Bang, and the idea, which was initially a pejorative term, kind of stuck. And the idea that if you trace things backwards, it has implications for a beginning point. And that was intriguing to some people, but again, it has been actually increasingly authenticated. It was interesting that Robert Wilson and Arno Penzias, two researchers with Bell Labs, actually accidentally discovered this cosmic background radiation that was uniform, and that gave some credibility to an actual beginning of the cosmos. And then the Cosmic Background Explorer, COBE satellite, was launched to measure that microwave radiation, and it amplified our understanding. But what was really interesting, and more recently, was the Wilkinson microwave anisotropy probe, WMAP, and that gave us additional details, and since that time there's even more clarification about this material. Some have actually speculated as a consequence of this, though there's a great deal of debate, and cosmology, as you well know, is something that is a volatile field in some respects, insofar as especially cosmogony, the origin of the cosmos, is a hotly debated issue. But some suggest, as a result of this implication, particularly because of the fact that the universe appears to be expanding more rapidly as distances increase, that there's some kind of a dark energy that's propelling that expansion, and the implication as well that 23% approximately of the universe is something that we now call dark matter, and we're trying to sort out what those words mean. Again, bearing in mind, they're terms for something we really do not know. 4% then, if that's correct, and it's a debated issue these days, but 4%, if that was on that account, would then be what we would call ordinary matter, which brings me to Alice in Wonderland. The universe is becoming curiouser and curiouser as time goes by. The extra idea of gravity and anti-gravity, the universe continues to expand. And as I say, it suggests that the greater the distance, the greater the expansion rate that occurs. So there seems to be some kind of an agency, some kind of a beginning point, which is consistent with the idea of a beginning of matter, energy, space, and time as we would know it. In this expanding universe, then, the show-stopping question that we have here is, with matter, energy, space, and time did not always exist, where did they come from? Now, there are others who will argue, like Dawkins in his God delusion. The question that he raises was, where does God come from? Now, that's actually a somewhat sophomoric question, because it's a category error insofar as you're trying to actually reduce the one who spoke matter, energy, space, and time into being, and to reduce them to actually being confined to those dynamics and those dimensions. And so it would be a nonsense question. At any rate, in addition to this, here's the Department of Entropy, where everything's falling apart. But this, the second law also is interesting and suggestive, because we well know that things left to themselves tend to move toward chaos and disorder. And in closed systems, the thermodynamic equilibrium, we move in that direction toward increasing entropy, increasing loss of information. Probabilistic equilibrium becomes more and more the case. And thus, in that context, then, we can have diminishment of energy. And in fact, in terms of useful energy, with the passage of time, it's an exponential decay curve that moves us in this direction, which, if pressed backwards, can only carry us so far. It would only carry us to the point where as the cosmos was like a clock that was perfectly wound up. But you could not have more useful energy than there is total energy, so that would point to a beginning point. If you look in the other direction of the arrow, it would appear that ultimately the heat death of the universe would be suggested, insofar as there would not be enough useful energy to sustain even the simplest systems. And so this becomes a problem that would ultimately, not immediately, but be an issue that would have to be dealt with. The universe having a beginning, then, is an interesting idea, because in looking at that, and I think it has profound implications, if this is so, for the way we do and look at science and reason, and look at the whole issue of faith. I don't believe the heart can rejoice in what the mind rejects. And in my own view, faith should be considered in this way, an evidence-based commitment, rather than something that just goes against the evidence, that's just faith in faith. And so the question is whether the faith that we have in any condition is warranted by the evidence itself. In fact, we all live by faith. It takes a measure of faith to do a number of things we do. Get in a car takes a good deal of faith. I don't know about you, but I have a lot of experiences like that. Getting into an airplane as well. Now, I base that faith on the track record of the airline and so forth. There's good warrant, and I rarely find myself looking into the cockpit to see who's in there. because I pretty well trust the system. You could have some folks, some people like this in there, and that's a scary thought. But you're pretty confident that we're not dealing with podunk airlines, so you're pretty confident that you're going to move in there, and you may not even, the typical person may not understand the whole idea of aerodynamics and lift and so forth, but they get in there, and some who are seasoned travelers don't even bother looking out the window. They're so accustomed to it, they don't even notice when the thing takes off, don't pay much attention when it lands. Then there's the other guy who's the first-time traveler, and he's got the white knuckles. He's gripping the seat for all he can do. But what's interesting about this is that both of them get to the same destination. It's not a question of how much faith they have, but whether the faith is warranted. Is the object sufficient? Everyone, I believe, lives by faith, but the issue is the faith warranted by the evidence itself? And so these are things that we all experience along the way. The second of my features that we're going to be quickly taking a look at is the fine-tuning of the cosmos, because we know more and more that you've got to have the right particles, the right kinds of atoms and molecules, that you have to have the right galaxy, the just right star masses, the just right expansion rate, as well as the right kind of star, the right kind of planet, even the right kind of moon. And all of these are fine-tuning parameters that are intriguing, that almost works as if it were a clock or a watch that was organized and finely tuned so that each of the components works together synergistically, the total being greater than the sum of the parts. Now, Carl Sagan, when he wrote about the cosmos, and you recall that his book, The Idea of Contact, you might recall the movie that was made from that with Jodie Foster, and the idea was all these billions, he was very famous, as you know, for billions and billions and that sort of a notion, but at that time that he was talking about that, rightly anticipated that there would be millions of planets, even in our own galaxy. But the question would be habitability and suitability for life, because at that time there were only a handful of known fine-tuning parameters, and in that particular time, dozens since then, and then scores, and now literally hundreds of fine-tuning parameters have been discovered and continue to be uncovered all along. In fact, we're discovering so many parameters each year that things seem so delicate, so perfectly balanced. Going back to Fred Hoyle, whose position had changed, he actually put it this way: a common sense interpretation of the facts suggests that a super intellect is monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. Now, without going into detail, we just explore a few of these parameters, and we begin to see some interesting things. How is it possible for there to be molecules, let alone life? And the only way you can have molecules and atoms and so forth, you have to have the right molecular bonding, you have to have the right amount of electromagnetic force. If it's just a little bit larger or smaller, we have a problem of not having atoms at all. A number of fine-tuning parameters that require the strong nuclear force being in the extremely precise quotient, and so forth. Slightly more, slightly less, you wouldn't have life because you wouldn't have molecules. With a weak nuclear force, we're discovering that too is pretty finely tuned, any more or less, and you couldn't have stars and galaxies. And so we've come to understand more and more that these fine-tuning parameters, with its constants, laws, initial conditions, requires exquisite balance to produce the relatively stable environment which makes life possible. And just to illustrate a couple of these, the force of gravity is extremely refined, and as well the neutron. If the neutron were just 0.1% more or less massive, you would not have the conditions or elements necessary for life itself. But if we consider something a little bit more significant than that, perhaps if we consider the ratio of the electron mass to the proton mass, it's so exquisitely fine-tuned that if it's one part in 10 to the 37th, larger or smaller, you would not actually be able to have atoms themselves, let alone molecules. And if you consider our US government debt, for example, which is an increasingly depressing topic, but the money needed to pay for that debt would actually require 1 square mile of dimes, less than 10 feet deep. But if an analogy, we took a perspective here And imagine trying to envision the probability of 1 in 10 to the 37th, that fine-tuning parameter. If we imagine instead of a square mile, not just America, but actually all of the continent of North America, and we imagine dimes there that extend not 10 feet, but actually to the moon, 239,000 miles and back, and then multiply that by 1 billion. And then you have to have a friend who picks one of those dimes that has been marked red in one of those billion piles that goes to the moon, size of the North America. That's getting close to the probabilities we're talking about. So it again raises questions that require some real problems. And it's even worse with the expansion rate of the universe, because if the expansion rate of the universe were 1 or plus or minus 1 in 10 to the 55th, faster or slower, it would have either led to a big crunch immediately, or it would have spun off so fast you wouldn't have galactic formation at all. So again, we are talking about probability that's so minute, it's far worse than the one we were just looking at. It's about, the best I could find was imagining a smooth glass surface and a pencil, and your job is to balance the pencil without any external forces with its point standing up, and then multiply that by 1 million, and you're getting in that range. Or stellar mass, again, the electromagnetic force and its ratio to the gravitational force. If it changes, in fact, by 1 part in 10 to the 40th, then you would either have only small stars or only large stars, not the middle-sized stars required for life. And so again, that's a very small number. This one is not as bad a problem, but even the right kind of galaxy, being a spiral rather than elliptical or irregular, estimates vary. Only spiral galaxies provide the safe zone for life-sustaining planets, and it's interesting that with spiral galaxies, another recently discovered fine-tuning parameter is that there's only a 4% band that's habitable, a galactic habitable zone, and that's something that was not grasped before. But estimates vary a good deal, whether they're 20%. There's different ranges that I've seen going up there, but it has to be the right kind of galaxy. It has to be the right kind of sun. Basically, a yellow dwarf, a G dwarf is our star, and what you have here is just the right light that is emitting a balance of red and blue, which allows photosynthesis, the right composition, with a high metallicity, so that you could create terrestrial planets, as well as the right orbit of our own planets, so that we have stable temperatures. There are many, many other fine-tuning parameters, including that it has to be a single star system. If you recall from Star Wars, remember in Tatooine there were like 2 or 3 stars. It won't work because it would be too unstable an environment. It has to be a single star system. It has to have the right luminosity. It has the right to have the right stability and so forth. And then there's also the circumstellar habitable zone. Of course, this is not to scale, plus or minus 5%. The right distance from the sun, too far, and water and carbon dioxide freezes, too close, we boil off the Earth's oceans and so forth. So again, we have all these components, and when we take, say, 100 of these fine-tuning parameters and use conservative estimates for those, adding them up exponentially, and we're only dealing with 100, not the 600 or 700 that now seem to be out there. Estimates conservatively might suggest a chance of 1 in 10 to the 215 to have all the parameters all working in synchronicity such that we can have this discussion together. If we estimate a number of planets at 10 to the 22, which is a pretty substantial estimate, then we reduce that now. We have 1 chance in 10 to the 193. And so this has raised some questions for people who have now appealed to other approaches, because it seems that it's too much of an anthropic principle, that we've almost like won the cosmic lottery. And so many have plumped for a universe, a multiverse rather, along these lines, precisely because it at least deal with the fine-tuning parameters instead of having trillions upon trillions of other universes that would be necessary, where we just happen to be here. The fact that we're having this discussion means that we were the winner, or one of the winners. The problem, in part, with this, though, is that the thing can be driven, if we're not careful, by something that has no actual direct empirical warrant. That is to say, no direct measurability one universe being impervious to observation by another. And not to say that there couldn't be more universes, but there seems to be no empirical warrant for the speculative, though creative, mathematical constructs that emerge from this, like M theory, brain theory, and so forth, various forms of string theory. Clever constructs, but again, the question is whether there's any empirical warrant for that approach. Physicist Edward Harrison has written, take your choice, blind chance that requires multitudes of universes, or design that requires only one. We all know what inference to the best explanation looks like. When we look at, for example, Mount Rushmore, and we look at the Black Hills of South Dakota, we attribute most of it, of course, to natural forces, but the portion featuring the likenesses of Washington, Jefferson, Roosevelt, and Abraham certainly clearly suggests, Abraham Lincoln rather, suggests that maybe erosion is not the best inference. That probabilities of sandstorms and erosions. And so we recognize that it suggests some kind of a designing agency. In fact, designer Gutzon Borglum, around 1930 in this image, used simple multiplication and a plumb line to transfer the measurements of a scale modeled in his studio onto the mountain. So we know what that's like, and we can discern design agency in that regard. A third feature of the universe, besides the evidence for the universe's beginning, and secondly, for its fine-tuning, is suggested by abiogenesis, the origin of life itself, which, by the way, is such that the cell, being exquisitely complex, as Michael Denton put it, chemical evolution is no more or less than the great cosmogenic myth. He's not appealing, you see, at this juncture. You cannot appeal to mutations in natural selection because we're not dealing with a living system. We're dealing at this juncture with basically materials that are not in themselves animate. They're not in themselves alive. In Franklin Harold's The Way of the Cell, artificial languages and their decoding systems, memory banks for information storage and retrieval, elegant control systems for regulating the automated assembly of parts and components, error, fail-safe, and proofreading devices utilized for quality control, assembly processes involving the principle of prefabrication and modular construction, and a capacity not equaled in any of our own most advanced machines, for would it be capable of replicating its entire structure within a matter of a few hours. And we have nothing really that is like that. It's the most amazing thing that we could imagine, because the more we look at it, though it was initially supposed by Darwin and others and his followers that it was like Lego blocks, blobs of protoplasm, effectively. It turns out these so-called simple blocks are themselves as exquisitely complex as the whole body. Going back to Nagel, for a long time I've been skeptical of the claims of traditional evolutional theory to be the whole story about the history of life. As we saw him say earlier, the possibility of DNA in life because of information, which we'll talk about in just a moment, may be something that transcends the question of where on Earth or how could we get one of these living cells? Because, again, you can't appeal to just some kind of a selective process. That only applies to living systems. You have to go back to chemistry and molecular biology. One molecular biologist, Michael Behe, called it Darwin's black box precisely because at that time it was not a problem, but now that we've peered through the innovative methods of X-ray crystallography and nuclear magnetic resonance, we begin to see fine-tuning parameters. We begin to see exquisite elegance that's involved with these materials, the protein structures and so forth, that make it more complex if expanded to than a major city. Cell complexity and elegance has really become increasingly impressive as we begin to see more and more elegant features being discovered. And so we're seeing things that boggle the imagination, and it's intriguing to me that all of these components need to be there in a synchronous manner for it even to be possible for us to have a thing that we would call life. If we just look at proteins, for example, the possibility of creating and synthesizing a simple protein through undirected natural processes would border on this absurd, because you're dealing here with hundreds of amino acids, and there are 20 kinds of amino acids that need to be used in living systems. And as we put these together, you have a gradual buildup of polypeptide bonds that actually have to be in a precisely ordered sequence. Not only the difficulty of getting larger and larger bonds to work, but also the right sequence of the amino acids for it to be something that's not nonsense. Adding to that the problem that in all living systems on our planet, we have seen that we know are left and right-handed amino acids that can interact with one another, but all living systems only use left-handed amino acids. And so if you have even a protein with even one right-handed amino acid, the protein will be non-functional. It will not be able to actually be used in a living system, rendered useless. If we consider a modest-sized protein of 400 amino acids, it would almost be like tossing a fair coin and getting it to actually 400 times to get heads. After a while, I'd get rather suspicious about the coin itself, whether it's a fair coin. But the point here is that this and other problems has actually led away from the idea of proteins being the vehicle that would have been actually used. That in fact, we've moved from an RNA world hypothesis, but that doesn't really solve the problem very well either. The minimum genome size requires a simultaneous occurrence of all the genetic products. You've got to have DNA and RNA. You have to have complex carbohydrates and lipids to form the cell wall. You've got to have the complex membrane. The cell membrane turns out to be almost as complex as the nucleus. And you can have no proteins without DNA, but you can't have DNA without proteins. And so you have parameters that continue to be multiplied. And then there's this bizarre mystery where you have this convergence of all these components that themselves, including the DNA, are not alive. But then suddenly when they converge in the right and perfect way, when all the components are there, suddenly this thing that transcends the ingredients themselves, namely life, appears. We don't even know what it is, but suddenly there it is, going beyond the materials themselves. To make matters worse, you have the whole nature of a complex three-dimensional topology of the folded proteins. There are 4 kinds of primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary folding processes that add information to the whole thing. And so it becomes, the more we learn about it, the more exquisite and strange it becomes. In fact, it's led some theorists, actually, some writers, have appealed to what they called directed panspermia. I don't know if you ever heard that term, but it means effectively that life has been seeded from extraterrestrial sources, perhaps meteors, something like that. Of course, the problem is pretty obvious, isn't it? All it does is push it back one level. Where did that life come from? So you're really not solving the problem. You say it came in from outer space, but the fact is, though, that it really doesn't work for you because you still need some kind of an agency that's going on. The fourth feature that I have in our brief time together is information theory. And looking at this, there can be no sudden infusion of complex information through undirected natural processes. This is not a God of the gaps idea. This is what we know information is like. This is where we know it comes from. Now, there are beautiful natural patterns in nature. Snowflakes, for example, and crystals as well, that have richness and beauty, sand dunes, hurricanes, tornadoes, stalagmites, stalactites, and so forth. Nature abounds with these wonderful patterns, including fractal systems like the Mandelbrot and Julia sets that are related to chaos theory, and they're mathematical descriptions of elegant patterns that go on forever. And these, while beautiful and complex in their own nature, actually turn out, though, not to be information rich. They have symmetry and complexity, but not much information. Like, for example, sodium chloride crystals. It's a repetitive sort of a thing. Pattern is not the same as design. You see, unlike a fractal, if you're dealing with something like music, or if you're dealing with maps or instructions, you have something dramatically different. Human language is this way, as is computer language and as well DNA. Because you see, you're dealing with systems that have to have a symbolic representation of physical systems or physical things. So music is a symbolic representation of the movement of sound waves. We could say that a map of Italy is a code that has information, but it corresponds to something out there. It's what we would call specified complexity, not just uninformed complexity. You're dealing with something now that actually has information. And this is the nature of DNA, which is, in fact, the most exquisitely engineered communication protocol that we know, your DNA. And it's intriguing when we look at the DNA itself that you have all the components of almost like a linguistic system that are involved. It's a language because it encodes the information necessary for life, including the double helix structure. And its 3.2 billion nucleotide pairs, you actually have a 4-letter alphabet. So you have, for example, the A, adenine, and then you also have another letter, C, cytosine. Third, you have guanine, and fourth, you have thymine. And these 4 letters then, in turn, combine together such that every 3 of them forms what's called a codon. A TTG, for example, codon will correspond to one of the 20 amino acids that need to be fabricated, such that when you have messenger RNA that goes into the cell and then pulls off and then replicates some of the material, it unspools and spools back, sends it back into the cytoplasm, goes into the ribosome, and then creates an actual protein itself by collecting the amino acids there and putting it in the perfect system, putting the machine together, and then it has to go to another machine in the cytoplasm to fold it in the proper manner, and then it's sent off by cell transport mechanisms elsewhere. And it gets more and more wonderful the more we learn about it. But those words then, in fact, combine together to form sentences, namely the genes. And the sentences, in turn, become chapters, the chromosomes, the 23 chromosomes. And the chromosomes merge to become the human genome, which would effectively be the equivalent of a book. And so the question is where this information comes from. And as I said before, it carries more data than the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's astonishing how each of your 100 trillion cells, that you have spoolings within spoolings, such that 6 feet of this DNA is teased out, can be teased out, but it's all tightly compressed in your body. It's in your body. And that the DNA itself helps direct protein synthesis and so forth, but it doesn't direct how the actual proteins are assembled into types, tissues, organs, and body plans. It creates and fabricates the components. But it'd be like having a factory where you have all the components that are necessary, let's say for building an automobile. But then there needs to be another system, what's called epigenetic information, that is actually carried on by embryology. And in the embryological process, the actual body plans are then takes the materials that are forged by the DNA, namely the proteins, and then assembles them according to various body plans and breaks out the kind of cells that are necessary. These two are different sentences. He didn't steal that car, as opposed to he didn't steal that car. And as you can see, it requires intentionality to understand which are we dealing with, you see. Whether we're talking about the same sentence, but they mean different things according to the intention that's involved, which is, of course, the level of mind. And the fundamental riddle that we have to have is that the lower cannot account for the higher. And so if you have a green light, what does it mean? Well, it could mean that it's time to get moving. The lights just turned green. Or it could mean, in another context, that you have the open door for a project. You've got the green light to proceed with that. And so it can be used metaphorically. But the point is that the lower can never account for the higher, but the higher can encompass the lower. And so I'm looking at a top-down orientation rather than a bottom-up. At any rate, mathematician Norbert Wiener, who is involved with cybernetics, put it this way: information is information, neither matter nor energy. He said, any materialism that fails to take account of this will not survive one day. And so what he means by this is effectively that information itself actually transcends matter and energy. We're having this conversation, it's being recorded. You could turn it in, for example, into an MP3 file. You could forward that MP3, you could send it as an electronic transmission, this digital file. You can open that file up, let's say, on a mobile device or on a laptop. And what you're having in each case, though, is the same information. That is to say, whether it is energy, where you're looking at photons of light from the screen, or whether it's auditory, if you hear somebody actually having transcribed it or speaking it out or printing it out, it's the same information. This is why a DVD that is blank weighs no less or more than a DVD that has a film on it, that's loaded with a film, because the information transcends the system. And so this is an important perspective that is only really being appreciated in recent years, that information transcends those components themselves. It's another dimension. And this brings us to what we might call an atheistic riddle, which asks the question, showing me a message that doesn't come from a mind, because if it's a message, there's some intentionality, there's grammar, and so forth. There's intentionality behind it. Now, there is promissory materialism, and by that I mean that I've talked with people about this sort of thing, and some say, well, perhaps someday we'll find some understanding of how you could get information out of random processes. But in my view, that this is actually faith without evidence, because the universe, as we know, isn't eternal, but they're willing to come up with exotic theories that are actually going to move them in this direction, that somehow promissory materialism works. But we already know what information is like and how it is derived. It's derived from mind, which brings me, as I tie the threads together, to other features of the world, including human consciousness, including rationality. What is the warrant? What is the basis for rationality? What is the basis for moral values and obligations? A feature of the world such as our aesthetic capacity for beauty, for human dignity. What is the warrant that provides dignity and value and purpose, and also undergirds the nature of human rights? And so these are features of the world, in addition to others that we've talked about, that need to at least be explored. And so we also have the universal religious experience along those lines. Putting all that together, I tie just a few implications together for you. And there are some inescapable conclusions of naturalism if I embrace a philosophical naturalism, namely matter, energy, space, and time, nothing transcending it. One, of course, would be obvious, and there is no ultimate basis for meaning in life. It basically be like the concept of no transcendence, that is to say, nothing beyond us, nothing that goes on beyond us in our own lives, and no life after death as well. And so the second implication, no life after. It reminds me of Woody Allen in a Rolling Stones magazine interview when he was asked if he wanted to live on in the hearts of his friends. Woody Allen said, "No, I want to live on in my apartment." And what he meant by that was effectively that what good will it do if my friend, because what happens when your friends die? You'll be remembered by his friends. What happens when they die? So it raises these questions that are certainly worth considering. No absolute foundation for right or wrong, because you can't turn an is into an ought if you only have matter, energy, space, and time. There's no moral imperative, for example, in survival. What's fit survives, and what survives is fit, but there's no moral imperative behind that. Many people want to be relativists and say, that's true for you, but not for me, but it doesn't work real well in this world when, for example, you have a disagreement with your bank, and you've just had a check that was not honored. You said, I have $3,000 in my account. They say, sir, you only have $30. Well, that's true for you, but not for me. It doesn't work well in this world. Or I can turn a relativist into an absolutist pretty quickly by stepping in front of them on line. I've had fun doing that, and it's kind of enjoyable to do that because you watch people then get morally indignant, even if they were moral relativists. You see people live better than that than that kind of a worldview. Another conclusion of it would be that there would be no ultimate meaning for life, a tale told by an idiot full of sound and fury, signifying nothing, and ultimately really no basis for free will, a product of our selfish genes. But we can't live as if we have no wills. like this. And it's a debated issue, of course, but the way we live is if we really have, even when we say there is no free will, we're making a volitional choice to make that claim. So at the end of the day, my own view is that there are at least worthwhile empirical evidences that suggest and point by means of inference to the best explanation to some kind of design agency as being the most plausible account for what we observe as the features of this world. And in my own mind, then, that would point me beyond that to a designer, though I'm being modest in terms of what I'm claiming that designer would be like. That is to say, as to the nature of that designer, that's a separate discussion. But at least it suggests the openness to some kind of design agency. Given that, and I think I've achieved my goal of getting done in less than an hour. So I just did that. Now, having done that, I want to open it up for a little interaction with you. So I don't know how we handle this. Do we need to have a hand microphone or something like that? Or I'd be glad to repeat the questions if you wish, either way. We have, I believe, what's our time frame? We go to 10 or 15 minutes will be fine. And I don't know, just if you say it loud enough, I'll try to repeat it, make sure we all... You have a microphone? Okay. So I'm just giving you a big picture, big overview, and just see what your thoughts are along these lines. I'll just turn this off here. Where's the first? Okay, there we are. Okay.
I was thinking about when you were talking about left-handed amino acids, right?
Right, yeah.
The amino acids aren't selected at random, they're selected by transfer RNA, and transfer RNA only selects amino acids.
Right.
Where it goes into right?
Yes, the transfer RNA will only select those kinds. But the nature of the programming that actually causes the transfer RNA to do such a thing is always questionable, because then you're right back to, if you're dealing with protein synthesis prior to the RNA itself. This is why an RNA world has been speculated as being a way of getting around it. However, there are, in my view, significant problems with the production of an RNA, but precisely so. So largely speaking, people have abandoned the protein synthesis model and have appealed to an RNA world, yeah. But there are, in my view, problems with the RNA itself, yeah. There's one right here. Yeah, question right here.
I've read several popular level books on neurobiology that the human brain from infancy to adulthood engages in what you might call transcendence.
Yes.
These trillions of cells that work
yes.
together
yes.
achieve more than the sum of their
yes.
parts. How would a naturalistic view of that kind of a phenomenon explain?
The experience of transcendence, yeah. Because essentially what a naturalist would have to say is that transcendence, or that experience, is an epiphenomenon of material causality. Namely, that we have certain things that are going on that create the illusion of something beyond ourselves. But having said that, what's in fact interesting is that the weight of the evidence is moving us more and more to elegance, complex specificity, irreducible complexity. I just discovered, no, I didn't discover it, but I just found out another interesting thing. I always love to find new things out about the complexity of the world. It turns out, for example, that the actual neurons, that the dendrites within the neurons in the brain, which were previously supposed that they would just transfer the message from one neuron to another through the synapse. Turns out that each of those dendrites, word comes from tree, Greek word for tree, is an operating system. That effectively it's functioning like a computer, doing an operation on the material itself, which just changed the rules because it increases the processing capacity of the brain by an order of at least 2 magnitudes. But that's fun stuff. And then the glia itself, another thing. But my point is this. Yes, you can make such a claim, but again, there are, I think, strong evidences that suggest that these experiences cannot be just merely reduced to biological experiences. There are some more and more studies, for example, even of near-death experiences that have been very intriguing along that line. Some of them are bogus, but there are some things that are found that are very, very compelling as well. So that's the best that I think that could be done, would be to basically claim that this is just an epiphenomenon of a naturalistic process. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for coming. Your knowledge base is clearly impressive. Listening to cosmological evidence and biological, biophysical evidence and linguistic evidence all basically suggest clearly the complexity of the universe that we find ourselves in and our own world and so forth. And so basically the fundamental treatise is that because of this complexity and the improbability of random occurrence, it's kind of like, you know, walking down the beach and finding the watch and saying, what's the probability this occurred through a random process? It's clearly something that would have been created through design, designed in some way. And I agree with all that, I really do. My question is this: what does creation as we see it and we study it, whether it's biophysical or syntactic or cosmological, what does it tell us about the nature of the Creator?
Yes, that's a great question. And so you're pushing me beyond now where I was, because I was sticking to the incontrovertible features of the world. There is a text in Romans 1 that does mention something like this. Since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes, his eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they're without excuse. The argument that Paul raises there is that there's something about eternal power, divine nature being evident. Now, his claim is that it's evident within. Now, his argument in part is based upon the imago Dei, the image of God that's placed within us, so that we actually have a cognitive capacity for apprehension of spiritual reality, as well as the capacity to correspond in our mind's understanding, a rational appraisal of what we see in the empirical world that corresponds with reality itself, which is pretty big leap when you really think about the rationality of the mind itself. My own view then is that it suggests at least a robust account of some kind of a mind such that the effect can never be greater than the cause. And so when we're looking at complexity, information itself, we're looking at intentionality, we're looking at these features of the world, it suggests, in my view at least, that, as I said before, the lesser cannot account for the greater. So if I brought, for example, a book to a population that had never learned to read, they had no category, they had no written language, and if I bring a book to them and show them this book, what will they do with the thing? You could describe what it looks like. They could feel it and touch it and so forth. And on one level, you could say, now that black stuff there is ink. It's called ink. And this stuff is called paper. And on that level, it can account for the book, can it not? But there's another level. Then you can teach them the alphabet, and you can show them that this little squiggle here is really this, and that this squiggle is another thing. And after a while, they can begin to see that those little things are not random, but they are like little symbols. The next level up is I can show how clusters of those little symbols form what we would call words, that the words themselves then form sentences which are actual units of idea of cognition, and you can move beyond that to actual content, such that you could have content about the world, there could be moral or aesthetic or spiritual truth that's encountered by that. You see where I'm going? The upper can account for the lower, but the lower cannot actually account for the higher levels. So if you reduce it merely to a reductionistic account, it is not sufficient to account for the complexity that we see, not only in the cell, but even within our own minds and our capacities, let alone a foundation for rationality, for consciousness, for a moral conscience, as well as for relationships themselves. And again, this is what's interesting. Even a full-blown existentialist, to recall Camus and Sartre, even the people like that, who felt that the universe was a context in which there is total absurdity, actually couldn't live in a way that was consistent with such a philosophy, because they lived for certain small-term projects. And so they got involved in certain things. In other words, I'm suggesting here that they actually go beyond their own philosophy in doing so. So it's a long answer to your question, but in my view, there's a robust idea of mind. Now, let me take you, since we're talking about this, I'll just throw in one extra thing. There's a verse that takes us before Genesis 1. Go before Genesis 1. What would it be? John 1. In the beginning was the Logos. The Logos, the Word, was with God, and the Logos was God. And in the beginning, all things came into being through the Logos, the Word, and apart from him, nothing's come into being that's come into being. So my own view then would be that the Word, that the mind that spoke these physical things into being, would account for the qualia that we see in the world itself. But again, that's a different discussion entirely. We go beyond the realm of science when we do that. So I was just trying to limit myself not to identify the nature of the designer itself, but just to be open to the possibility of a design agency, bearing in mind once again that the progenitors of science felt that their own science was actually a mode of worship rather than something that was antithetical to science. So it's important for us. How are we doing on our time? Are we have a couple minutes, or your call? Yeah. Similar, okay.
Yeah, very similar question.
Okay.
Extrapolate yourself 50, 60, 100 years from now.
Okay.
Technology changing.
Yes.
Information happening fairly quickly.
Yeah.
Give us a dream that you have.
Give us a dream. That's a great... We were just talking about this at lunch. But what's astonishing about this world, this is the most wonderful time to live. Before I go to that, I'm going to make an interesting comment that I pretty much picked up from Pensée by Pascal. And Pascal's Pensée, in one of his Pensée, he argues that actually it appears that the creator, the designer, has apportioned the evidence in such a manner as there is enough warrant and evidence to satisfy the mind of a person who chooses to believe, but there's also enough ambiguity to enable the unbeliever to rationalize his disbelief. And then you can draw an implication from that. And the implication is an interesting one, and it's this, that as skepticism has increased, and it certainly has in our time, more than ever before, yet at the same time then, if Pascal was right, one would expect that the ante of evidence would be bumped up, and indeed such it is. Ironically, it's science that has actually been the ally in bumping up this evidence of, for example, irreducible complexity. Just to take one of Michael Behe's icons of that, the idea of the bacterial flagellum, which involves over 40 proteins that must be perfectly synchronized and sequenced together in such a way that they have to be built the right way, they have to be in the right proportions and so forth. And you have the equivalence of a motor that has a stator and an O-ring, an S-ring, it has bushings and so forth, it has a drive shaft. And the thing is basically a biological motor that runs at 100,000 RPM on an acid-based motor with over 99% efficiency and can stop on a quarter of a turn in reverse direction. We don't have anything we've built that will be even wildly near such a thing. And the argument here is that all the components need to be in concert. They all have to work together, that there's a minimal complexity, an irreducible complexity that is necessary, and there is a wide array, in fact a growing number of such examples that we see, all of which in my mind are suggestive. Now to go to your question, we were discussing at lunch how it seems that I'm a film buff. One of the things I teach is film and literature because I love story. I just love narrative. And it's really fun. I'm almost tempted to do this, to go through the decades, you know, from the earliest inception of film and then to move each decade and to look at their science fiction, you know, the Earth to the Moon thing that was done in 1904, for example, and to take each of their science fiction vehicles and to show how they actually illustrate the science of that time directed writ large on the future. And how many total absurdities that emerge from that, although there have been some interesting guesses. But it's interesting because one can say, let's say in 1960, that nobody had a category for a thing that we would call the World Wide Web, of email, of the internet. No category. There was no cognition, no anticipation of such a phenomenon in the scientific realm. What I'm suggesting here is that not only is our knowledge base increasing exponentially, but so also is the capacity for systems to be developed and so forth that defy almost our imaginative capacities, so that one wonders, if I'm holding a device here in my hand that has more information, I was saying at lunch that I went to the Air and Space Museum in Dulles Airport, and it was fun to see. I have a photograph in here of one of the computers that was used for the space program. It was an early 60s computer. It cost $1.9 million, and the thing had a capacity of 128K. So I have 64 gigs in this crazy thing here, and so the thing's worth billions in terms of that time. But the fact is that no one could have guessed that I can attach or derive all the world's knowledge from this device. What do you suppose 5 years will bring? And my answer is you don't have the cognitive equipment or imagination to do it. Because by its nature, it'll be an innovation, and it'll be something that came out, and then we'll look back and say, I see. But really, you can't fully see it. So I think it's really an exciting time to live. I'm just suggesting things that, and that's going to be also increasingly, if we're not careful, have some downsides as well. My concern, by the way, is as technology increases and knowledge increases, that increases power, does it not? But if you do not have a moral apprehension that correspondingly increases, namely a thing called wisdom, then you have a very dangerous, volatile combination of a lack of wisdom but more power than ever before. And you can imagine the implications of that. It goes back to a lot of the old legends and old stories. The first that I think of particularly is the Golem, not as in the Lord of the Rings, but the Golem legend, the Golem of Prague in the 17th century, and they created this clay figure that actually became alive. And the thing began to do stuff that they didn't want it to do. And we got the whole Frankenstein idea as a kind of a later follow-up of that idea. Then I think of iRobot, I think of AI, I think, of course, of the HAL 9000 series. You remember? Dave, stop, Dave. And I think about the films like that, and they all raise this question, suppose you could create a device that began to have ideas of its own. That's a fun thing to think about, but it's also scary. And, of course, this very nature of having volitional capacity that can transcend and go beyond. Then you have the whole issue of the matrix and what's real and so forth. And is it possible for such a thing that the machines can eventually begin to rule us? So you have these dark approaches, and then you have much more positive, sanguine approaches. And I think what you're about is cutting-edge understanding of things that the world has not yet seen, that you can be a part of, that will be quite extraordinary and exciting. But frankly, I don't think we have the cognitive equipment to imagine what the next 5 years will bring about, let alone 10. So it's quite extraordinary because the rate of change, as you know, is itself changing. It's going up that way. And so it's almost anyone's guess along that line. How are we doing on our time? Do we have one more question, okay? And it's over here. Yes?
Yeah, we had a question with the advertised age of the Earth being 4.5 billion.
Approximately, yeah, 4.5 billion years.
Your thoughts on that? Is that correct? Is it even possible to put an age on the Earth?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of assumptions that are involved in the radiometric dating methods, of course, when you're dealing with uranium to lead and strontium and potassium and all of these various components, potassium argon rather, all these various radiogenic methods that are being used. And there are certain assumptions that the daughter product is a derivative, that there was no leaching or change and so forth. Having said that, though, there is, as I said before, a pretty big tent. And my own view is not to come down hard on the dating issue. The best evidence we have right now seems to still point to about a 13.7 billion year Big Bang, going back to the Big Bang itself. Question about inflationary Big Bangs, the question about the nature of time itself relative to the reference, and all of that. But having said that, again, as I said before, my approach is a little bit more modest. In fact, you read the accounts, and there's a pretty strong degree of latitude in interpretation of Genesis 1 and 2. I live in a certain tensioned interplay where I recognize certain assumptions are made. hold them with a loose enough grip, but at the same time, I want to go where the evidence leads. And so it seems at this time that a hot Big Bang about 13.7 billion years ago seems to be the most plausible account at this juncture, as best as I can tell. But, you know, I also want to have what's called epistemic humility. You know what that means? It means don't be so cocky that you think you got all the answers. There may be a possibility of some change. It's been education, good education has been described as this, moving from cocksure ignorance to thoughtful uncertainty. You with me on that? So I think a wise person is to evaluate, adjudicate, assess, but also not be so dogmatic that you're impervious to new insights and new scientific grasp, because otherwise you will occlude new insights by your own filter system. And so my own view is I'm not afraid to go where the evidence leads, because my own view, again, and I'll stop with this, is that all truth is derivative from the mind of the Creator. And so in my own thinking then, my view as well is that that Creator is a personal agency, because I believe that personality transcends impersonal causes. That's why, by the way, we have dogs and cats as our pets, not earthworms and cockroaches. They're not very interesting. You got Ernie the earthworm. Roll over and play dead. You don't even know if he did. But the fact is, at least dogs and cats have a measure of interest, you know. Although Gary Larson might disagree. What we say to our dogs, Ginger, get out of the trash. Ginger, stop doing this. And what the dog hears, Ginger, blah, blah, blah. Ginger, blah, blah, blah. That's all it hears. Then he says what we say to cats. Fluffy, stop doing it, get out of the trash. And Fluffy, stop doing it. What the cat hears? So there are different points of view, but at least they have rudimentary personality. They have minds, they have wills, they sure have emotions, do they not? You see, you put your best friend in the trunk of your car and leave him there for an hour. Put your dog in the trunk of your car, leave him there for an hour. Who'll be happy to see you when you open it up? So you have, you know, they're always wagging their tail. So personality is important, not something that's neuter or something that's inert, you see. So having said all that, my own view is a top-down orientation. My own view of wisdom is top-down rather than bottom-up. So I'll stop with that. Yeah.